The smell of burnt garlic bread and cheap Merlot was still heavy in the air when she walked away, leaving him with a $60 bill and a hollow chest. Arthur was 32, broke and raising a toddler alone. He was used to rejection. What he wasn't used to was the woman in the $4,000 suit sliding into the booth exactly 3 minutes later. She didn't offer sympathy. She slid a napkin across the sticky table. I heard everything, she said, her voice like cold brass. "Can you be my husband?" The booth at Romano's Italian grill smelled heavily of scorched garlic, spilled red wine, and the lemon-scented industrial cleaner they used on the floors. Arthur stared at the condensation sliding down the curve of his water glass. A single drop hit the cheap paper coaster, soaking into the cardboard and warping the red printed tomato logo. He tracked its movement because looking at the water drop was infinitely easier than looking at Brenda. Brenda was carefully dabbing the corners of her mouth with a cloth napkin. Her lips were painted a harsh matte red that hadn't smudged despite her tearing through a plate of veal piccata. She chewed loudly, a wet, snapping sound that had grated on Arthur's nerves for the last 45 minutes. But she had stopped chewing now. The pivot was coming. Arthur could feel it in the sudden drop in temperature at the table, in the way she aligned her fork and knife perfectly parallel on her plate. "You're a nice guy," Arthur Brenda said. Her voice was practical. It sounded like a bank teller explaining an overdraft fee. Arthur forced his eyes up. His shirt collar stiff and slightly yellowed from too many cheap dry cleaning runs chafed against his neck. But he supplied quietly. His throat felt dry, lined with sandpaper, but Brenda agreed, leaning back. The synthetic leather of the booth squeaked in protest. "Look, I'm 34. I just made regional director. I work 60 hours a week. I'm looking for a partner, not a project." The word hit him in the sternum. "Project. I'm not a project," Arthur said, though the defense lacked heat. He thought of the stack of past-due utility bills sitting on his kitchen counter, held down by a half-empty bottle of generic children's Tylenol. He thought of Lily. His daughter was 4, currently battling a chest cold and being watched by Mrs. Higgins, who charged $15 an hour. This dinner was costing him time money, and now whatever scrap of dignity he had managed to iron into his suit. "You work at a hardware store," Brenda pointed out, not cruelly, just factually. "You rent a 1-bedroom apartment. You have a 4-year-old. You're a package deal, Arthur, and the package is heavy." She picked up her designer purse from the seat beside her. It was heavy structured leather, smelling faintly of expensive wax. "I need someone who can go to Napa for the weekend on a whim. Someone who doesn't have to check a babysitter's availability to get a drink past 8 p.m. "I understand," Arthur said. And the pathetic truth was he did. He didn't blame her. He wouldn't date himself either. He was exhausted. It lived in his marrow, a dull, thumping ache that never went away. He smelled like cheap coffee anxiety sweat and the faint, lingering scent of baby wipes. Brenda stood up. She dropped a $20 bill on the table. It barely covered her drinks. "Good luck, Arthur. Really. I hope you find what you're looking for." She walked away, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic retreat against the faux hardwood floor. Arthur sat there for a long time, listening to the clattering plates from the kitchen and the low hum of the neon sign in the window buzzing against the glass. He reached out and pulled the check toward him. $68. He closed his eyes. That was a week of groceries. That was a pair of winter boots for Lily. He paid with a credit card he prayed wouldn't decline, tipped the waitress who had been looking at him with suffocating pity, and walked out of the dining room. He didn't leave the restaurant, though. The rain outside was coming down in sheets slamming against the pavement. He stood in the narrow, dimly lit foyer, staring out the glass doors, watching the headlights of passing cars smear across the wet street. He shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his coat. The lining in the left pocket was torn. She was right, you know. The voice came from his left. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a scalpel. Arthur turned. A woman was standing near the hostess stand. She hadn't been there a moment ago, or if she had, Arthur had been too wrapped up in his own pathetic failure to notice. She was looking at him. Her eyes were dark, calculating, and entirely devoid of the pity he had just endured from his waitress. She wore a charcoal grey suit that fit her with a precision that bordered on aggressive. It was the kind of fabric that didn't wrinkle, the kind that cost more than Arthur's car. "Excuse me," Arthur muttered, his brow furrowing. He took a step back, instinctively defensive. "She was right," the woman repeated, stepping closer. The scent of her hit him before she even stopped moving. It was completely sterile. Ozone cold rain and the faint chemical crispness of dry cleaned silk. There was no floral perfume, no vanilla warmth. "You are a terrible investment for a woman looking for a social equal. You're weighed down. You have no capital, no mobility, and clearly no ego left to bruise." Arthur's jaw tightened. The exhaustion morphed rapidly into a hot, prickly anger. "I don't know who you are, lady, but you can go to hell." He turned back toward the doors, preferring the freezing rain to whatever psychotic breakdown this stranger was having. "My name is Claire Voss," she said to his back, "and I don't want a social equal. I want a husband." Arthur stopped. His hand was on the brass handle of the door. The metal was freezing. He didn't turn around. "Good for you. Go buy one." "I'm trying," Claire said. The flat, entirely serious tone of her voice finally made him look back over his shoulder. She was holding out a business card. It was thicker and matte black with silver embossed lettering. "Sit back down, Arthur," she said. "Let's talk." They didn't go back to the booth. Claire led him to the small empty bar area in the back of the restaurant. The bartender wiped down the dark wood counter, gave Claire's suit one intimidated glance, and retreated to the far end. Arthur sat on a leather stool that had lost its padding a decade ago. The vinyl dug into his thighs. He was acutely aware of how frayed his cuffs were resting against the polished bar top. Claire sat next to him. She didn't order a drink. She just folded her hands on the counter. Her nails were short, unpainted, perfectly filed. She didn't look like a woman desperate for a husband. She looked like a predator assessing the caloric value of a meal. "You know my name," Arthur said, the absurdity of the situation finally catching up to his tired brain. "How do you know my name?" "I was sitting in the booth behind you," Claire said, her voice dropping into a low, business-like register. "I heard your date. Brenda. Loud talker. Terrible enunciation. She laid out your entire life profile in under 15 minutes. Arthur Pendleton. Hardware store employee. Widower, I presume, or abandoned given the sole custody of a 4-year-old. Drowning in debt. Desperate enough to let a woman berate you over lukewarm pasta. It was veal. Arthur snapped, his cheeks burning. He dragged a hand down his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. "Look, if this is some kind of hidden camera show, I'm not in the mood. I have to go relieve my babysitter." "It's not a joke," Claire said. She turned her head, finally looking at him directly. Her face was striking but hard. High cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and eyes that held absolutely no warmth. "I am the CEO of Voss Industries. My board of directors is currently staging a quiet coup. They believe I am too ruthless, too disconnected, and too much of a liability to the public face of the company following a recent supply chain scandal." Arthur stared at her. "What does that have to do with me?" "They want to replace me with a family man," she said, the words dripping with a sudden, vicious contempt. "Someone relatable. Someone who plays golf and posts pictures of golden retrievers. They think I lack humanity. I have a shareholder meeting in 6 weeks. If I don't present a stabilized, grounded image, they will trigger a morality clause and force a buyout. So buy a dog, Arthur said, sliding off the stool. I'm going home. I need a husband. Claire stated, not raising her voice, but the sheer force of it made Arthur pause. A real one on paper, but not a real one in practice. I don't want a partner, Arthur. I don't want love or shared hobbies or someone who wants to talk about their feelings over breakfast. I want a prop, a highly convincing prop. Arthur barked a laugh, short and harsh. And you picked the broke guy with the kid, precisely because you are the broke guy with the kid, Claire said smoothly. She tapped a single finger against the dark wood of the bar. You're perfect. You're a dedicated single father. That plays beautifully to the press. You're working class. That shows I'm not an elitist snob. And most importantly, you have no money. Arthur stiffened. Excuse me. You have no leverage, Claire clarified, unbothered by his anger. If I marry another executive, it becomes a power struggle, a merger. If I marry you, I hold all the cards. You will do exactly what I say when I say it, because I will be the one keeping a roof over your child's head. The cruelty of her logic was breathtaking. It was so clinical, so perfectly engineered to humiliate him while offering him a lifeline. Arthur's stomach twisted. He wanted to throw his water in her face. He wanted to walk out into the rain and never look back. But then he heard his own internal math kicking in, the steady, suffocating ticking of the clock. Mrs. Higgins is 15 an hour. The electric bill is 200 past due. The eviction notice is a week away. You're out of your mind, Arthur whispered. Claire reached into her tailored jacket. She pulled out a sleek silver pen and a folded piece of heavy stock paper. She flattened it on the bar. It was a blank check. $3 million, Claire said quietly. She uncapped the pen. The soft click sounded like a gunshot in the empty bar. Deposited into a trust for your daughter tomorrow morning. A separate account for you, with a monthly allowance of $20,000. Health insurance premium tier. A new house in a secure neighborhood, deeded in your name after the 3-year contract expires. Arthur stopped breathing. The air in his lungs suddenly felt thick, heavy, with the scent of stale beer and life-altering money. He stared at the blank check. 3 years, Claire continued, her eyes locked on his profile. You live in my secondary residence. We do weekly public appearances. You sign an ironclad NDA and a prenuptial agreement. You do not ask questions about my business. You do not interfere in my personal life. We act the part of a newlywed couple swept up in a whirlwind romance for the cameras, and behind closed doors we do not exist to each other. Arthur's hands were shaking. He gripped the edge of the bar to steady them. The wood was cold under his palms. $3 million. It wasn't just breathing room. It was a completely different atmosphere. Lily could go to the best preschool. She could see a specialist for her asthma. He wouldn't have to choose between heating the apartment and buying groceries. He looked at Claire. Her expression was completely impassive. She wasn't judging him. She was just waiting for the transaction to complete. Why me, really? Arthur asked, his voice cracking. He hated how weak he sounded. You could hire an actor. Actors have egos. Actors want to be seen, Claire replied. You just want to survive, Arthur. I saw your face when that woman handed you the bill. You're a man who knows how to swallow his pride to keep his kid fed. That's the kind of discipline I need. It was the most insulting compliment he had ever received. It was entirely true. Arthur looked down at his scuffed, water-stained shoes. He thought of the way Brenda had looked at him like a leaky lifeboat. He thought of Claire looking at him like a human shield. Neither saw him as a man. but only one was offering to save his daughter's life. Slowly his hand moved across the bar. His fingers brushed the cold silver barrel of the pen. The morning after felt like a hangover, though Arthur hadn't touched Brenda's cheap wine. He woke to the sound of Lily coughing a wet, rattling noise that scraped against the thin walls of his bedroom. The apartment radiator clanked, spitting a pathetic hiss of steam into the freezing room. Arthur pulled the frayed duvet up to his chin. He stared at the yellowed water stain on the ceiling. It looked like a bruised eye. He rolled over. The heavy matte black business card sat on his nightstand, resting against a half-empty bottle of generic cough syrup. The silver-embossed letters caught the weak grey light filtering through the blinds. Claire Voss. It hadn't been a stress-induced hallucination. The $3 million was real. The offer was real. The sickening twist in his gut was real. Arthur threw off the covers. The linoleum floor was ice against his bare feet. He walked into the living room, which doubled as Lily's bedroom. She was asleep on the futon, her small face, flushed, her breathing shallow and laboured. The smell of Vicks Vapor Rub hung thick in the stale air, mixing with the scent of old cooking grease from the apartment below. Arthur knelt beside her, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. She was burning up. Again. He looked at the stack of final notice bills on the kitchen counter. Then he looked at the black card. 4 hours later, Arthur stood in the lobby of the Voss Industries building. The air here was violently conditioned. It smelled of ozone-polished marble and money. There was no dust. The security guards wore suits that fit better than Arthur's only wedding and funeral outfit. When he gave his name at the front desk, the receptionist didn't blink. She just handed him a key card that pulsed with a faint green light. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor made his ears pop. His stomach stayed somewhere around the 10th floor. He was ushered into a conference room made entirely of glass and steel. It was freezing. A man in a navy pinstripe suit sat at the far end of a massive oak table laying out stacks of paper. He didn't look up when Arthur entered. "Mr. Pendleton." "Take a seat," the man said. His voice was completely devoid of inflection. "I am Richard Vance's associate, Mr. Cole. Miss Voss will be joining us shortly." Arthur sat in a leather chair that yielded perfectly to his weight. It hissed softly. He kept his hands in his lap so Cole wouldn't see his knuckles turning white. The door opened, and Claire walked in. She wore a different suit today. This one stark white, paired with a silk blouse the color of bruised plums. She carried an iPad and a lukewarm cup of black coffee. She didn't look tired. She didn't look like a woman who had just proposed marriage to a stranger in a dive bar. She looked like a general surveying a conquered territory. "Arthur," she said, taking the seat opposite him. She didn't offer her hand. "Did you read the preliminary terms I emailed you?" "I read them," Arthur said. His voice sounded thin, reedy in the massive room. He cleared his throat. 3 years. We live in your townhouse. I get an allowance. Lily gets a trust. And I sign away my right to, well, everything. You retain your autonomy in private," Claire corrected, tapping a fingernail against her iPad. "You are an employee, Arthur. Your job title is husband. You will be compensated for your time, your discretion, and your ability to follow instructions." She gestured to the papers. Mr. Cole walked him through the non-disclosure agreement. For the next 2 hours, the room dissolved into a blur of legalese. Morality clauses, asset separation, custody stipulations in the event of early termination. Arthur learned that he was not allowed to be photographed with another woman. He learned that his alcohol consumption in public was capped at 2 drinks. He learned that if he spoke to the press without authorization, he would owe Voss Industries $10 million. "What about Lily?" Arthur asked, cutting Cole off mid-sentence. He looked directly at Claire. "She's 4. She doesn't understand NDAs. She's going to be confused. How much of this fake life am I supposed to force on her? Claire met his gaze. Her eyes were still that flat, calculating dark. Lily will have a nanny, a tutor, a private pediatrician. She will be shielded from the media. When we are in the townhouse, you and I will have separate wings. I have no interest in playing stepmother Arthur. As long as she doesn't interrupt my work, she can live exactly as you wish her to. Separate wings. The concept of a house large enough to have wings was entirely alien to him. The trust fund, Arthur said quietly. When does it clear? The moment your signature is on the final page of the prenuptial agreement, Claire said. The money will be escrowed. You can verify it before you leave the building. Arthur looked down at the contract. The paper was heavy, slightly textured. It felt expensive. He thought of the sound of Lily's chest rattling. He thought of Brenda's pitying sigh. He picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen Cole had placed in front of him. The metal was cold. He didn't read the last page. He just signed his name, Arthur Thomas Pendleton. The cursive looked messy, panicked a jagged scar across the bottom of the page. Claire watched him do it. She didn't smile. She didn't look relieved. She simply pulled the paper toward her, checked the signature, and stood up. Go home, pack your things, Claire said, turning toward the door. A car will collect you and your daughter at 8 tomorrow morning. Oh, and Arthur. He looked up, feeling entirely hollowed out. Throw away that suit, she said, glancing at his frayed collar. It smells like desperation. They moved on a Thursday. It didn't take long. Arthur's entire life, his clothes, Lily's toys, a box of mismatched dishware he couldn't bear to leave behind, fit into 6 cardboard boxes. The black SUV that arrived to collect them idled at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the grime of his apartment building. The driver, a broad-shouldered man named Davis, loaded the boxes in silence. Lily clung to Arthur's leg, her small fingers digging into his jeans. She was wearing a pink knit hat that was missing the pom-pom. Are we going on a trip, Daddy? She asked, her voice raspy from the lingering cold. We're moving to a new house, Bug, Arthur said, lifting her into the cavernous leather-scented back seat. A big house. The townhouse in the Gold Coast district didn't look like a home. It looked like an architectural rendering come to life. It was all sharp angles, dark slate, and massive panes of privacy glass. When Arthur stepped inside, the silence of the place hit him physically. There was no hum of traffic, no neighbors arguing through the ceiling. It was dead quiet. The air smelled of beeswax floor polish and fresh cut lilies. Claire was not there. Instead, they were greeted by an older woman with iron-grey hair pulled into a tight bun. Mr. Pendleton, I am Mrs. Gable, the house manager, she said, her tone perfectly polite and entirely impersonal. Ms. Voss is at the office. She instructed me to show you to your quarters. The child's room is adjacent to yours. The child? Arthur bristled, pulling Lily closer to his side. Her name is Lily. Mrs. Gable gave a stiff nod. Of course. This way. Arthur's quarters were larger than his entire previous apartment. The bedroom featured a king-sized bed with linens that felt like spun water, a walk-in closet the size of a garage, and a bathroom entirely clad in grey marble. Lily's room had been hastily furnished, a heavy wooden bed, a pristine white rug, and a single terrifyingly expensive-looking rocking horse. There was no colour, no warmth. It's too big, Lily whispered, her eyes wide, as she stared at the empty walls. We'll get some posters, Arthur promised softly, though he had no idea if tape was allowed on the pristine paint. He didn't have time to unpack. Less than an hour after they arrived, the intercom buzzed. A team of 4 people, armed with garment bags and rolling racks, invaded his bedroom. They were Claire's public relations and styling team. For 3 hours, Arthur was stripped down, measured, poked, and criticized. A man with aggressive cologne scrutinized Arthur's hair, sighing heavily before attacking it with shears. They discarded his jeans. They threw away his scuffed boots. They dressed him in charcoal wool trousers that draped perfectly, a crisp white shirt with mother-of-pearl buttons, and a tailored navy blazer. When they finally left, Arthur stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The man staring back was a stranger. His jaw looked sharper, his shoulders broader. The exhaustion was still there, hiding in the dark circles under his eyes, but the clothes acted as armor. He didn't look like a hardware store clerk drowning in debt. He looked like a man who belonged in a townhouse with a house manager. It made him feel sick. At 6 o'clock, the bedroom door opened without a knock. Claire walked in. She was wearing an emerald green evening gown that clung to her ribs and swept the floor. Diamonds rested against her collarbones, cold and sharp. She stopped in the center of the room, looking him up and down. Her expression remained impassive, an accountant reviewing a spreadsheet. Acceptable, she decided. "Where are we going?" Arthur asked, tugging uncomfortably at his cuffs. They felt too tight. "The Hospital Foundation Gala," Claire said, turning on her heel. "The press knows I'm bringing a guest. The narrative is that we met at a charity function 6 months ago. We kept it quiet to protect your daughter. Tonight is our debut." Arthur followed her down the sweeping glass staircase. 6 months, I don't even know your middle name." "It's Elizabeth," she said, without looking back. "And my favorite color is navy. Yours is red. You enjoy hiking, which explains your calloused hands. If anyone asks about your late wife, you politely decline to speak about it, because the grief is still too near." "Understood, you fabricated an entire history," Arthur muttered, stepping out into the cool evening air toward the waiting Maybach. "I curated a narrative," Claire corrected. The ride to the gala was silent. Claire worked on her phone, the blue light illuminating the sharp lines of her face. Arthur stared out the window, watching the city blur past. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt like he was walking to his own execution. The car slowed, turning onto a red-carpeted driveway. Beyond the tinted glass, a sea of flashing lights erupted. The paparazzi were a pulsing, shouting wall of bodies. Claire locked her phone. She put it in her clutch. Then she turned to him. The cold, sterile mask vanished. It was entirely jarring. Her eyes softened, her lips curved into a warm, radiant smile. She looked breathless, infatuated human. "Showtime, Arthur." She whispered, her voice suddenly entirely different, husky, intimate. The driver opened the door. The roar of the crowd and the blinding flashes washed over them. Claire slid out and Arthur followed. Before he could find his footing, Claire's hand locked onto his arm. Her fingers dug into his bicep. The grip was terrifyingly strong, her perfectly manicured nails biting through the expensive wool of his new suit. It was a warning. "Don't mess this up." But to the cameras, she was leaning into him, looking up at his face, like he was the only man on earth. "Smile, darling," Claire murmured through her perfect gleaming teeth, the pressure of her fingers increasing until it ached. "They're looking at us." The camera flashes were physical blows. They erupted in a relentless, strobing assault that left deep purple blotches swimming across Arthur's vision. The air on the red carpet smelled of hot electronics, damp asphalt, and the heavy, sweet rot of expensive floral perfumes. Arthur's instinct was to shield his face, to duck and pull Lily away from the blinding lights. But Lily was miles away in a silent, sterile bedroom, and the woman beside him was currently digging her acrylic nails so deeply into his bicep, he was certain she was breaking the skin. "Chin up," Claire murmured. Her voice was a warm, throaty purr, designed for the microphones lining the velvet rope, but the words were a direct order. "Look at me, Arthur." "Laugh." Arthur turned his head, his neck stiff, the starched collar of his bespoke shirt biting into his throat. He looked down at her. Claire was smiling, her eyes crinkled at the corners in a flawless imitation of joy. She looked ethereal, wrapped in emerald silk and diamonds. But up close, Arthur could see the microscopic bead of sweat at her hairline. He could hear the shallow, controlled rhythm of her breathing. She was working. This was manual labor, just dressed in couture. He forced a laugh, a dry, raspy sound that scraped against his vocal cords. The cameras swallowed it up, 100 shutters clicking in unison like a swarm of mechanical locusts. They breached the entrance of the ballroom, leaving the frenzy of the press line behind. The sudden drop in volume made Arthur's ears ring. The room was a cavern of gold-leaf crystal chandeliers and round tables draped in heavy ivory linen. A string quartet played in the corner, their music completely drowned out by the low murmuring hum of 100 conversations. Claire's grip on his arm loosened instantly. The warm, infatuated woman vanished, replaced immediately by the cold, calculating CEO. She didn't look at him. She was already scanning the room, categorizing the guests. "Table 4, Claire said, her voice dropping back to its normal flat register. "Gregory Thorne, board member. He's the one pushing hardest for the morality clause. We are going to walk over there. You will hold my chair. You will not drink anything alcoholic. If he asks about your work, you are vague but passionate." "Passionate about selling drywall screws," Arthur muttered. "Passionate about building foundations," Claire corrected sharply. "Move." Arthur allowed himself to be piloted through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. The people they passed parted for Claire like water around the prow of a battleship. They smiled, they nodded, but their eyes were universally hard, darting to Arthur with naked, undisguised curiosity. He felt like a zoo animal, a very expensive, very out-of-place exhibit. They reached table 4. Gregory was a large man, his tuxedo straining slightly at the buttons. He smelled strongly of gin and peppermints, a cloying chemical sweetness that made Arthur's stomach roll. Claire Gregory boomed, standing up. He didn't look happy to see her. "I didn't think this was your scene, and you brought a guest." "My fiancé, Gregory," Claire said smoothly. She extended her left hand. A diamond the size of a hazelnut rested on her ring finger. Arthur hadn't even seen her put it on. "Arthur Pendleton." "Arthur, this is Gregory, one of our senior board members." Arthur extended his hand. Gregory looked at it for a fraction of a second too long before taking it. His palm was damp. Pendleton, Gregory mused, rolling the name around in his mouth like a bad wine. "I don't know the family. Finance, real estate." Arthur felt the sudden crushing weight of the room pressing down on him. He thought of his last bank statement. $14.32. He felt the phantom itch of the rough, calloused skin on his palms, a direct contrast to Gregory's soft hands. He looked at Claire. She was sipping from a glass of water, watching him over the rim. "Waiting," neither Arthur said. He forced himself to drop his hand to his side, resisting the urge to stuff it into his pocket. "I work in hardware, Gregory. Supply and logistics at the ground level." Gregory's eyebrows shot up toward his receding hairline. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. "Hardware? You mean retail?" He looked at Claire, a gleam of predatory triumph in his eyes. "Well, Claire, that's certainly a departure from your usual mergers." Arthur felt a hot, dark spike of anger pierce through his exhaustion. He was a prop, yes. He had sold his pride for $3 million. But he refused to let this gin-soaked suit look at him like a stain on the carpet. "It's about understanding the base materials," Arthur said, his voice lowering, dropping the nervous, reedy pitch. He looked directly into Gregory's eyes. "You can draw up the most expensive blueprints in the world, Gregory. But if the guy on the floor doesn't secure the framing, right, the whole house comes down. I prefer to know how things are built before I try to sell them." The silence that followed was heavy. Gregory's smile faltered, the patronizing amusement replaced by a flicker of irritation. Beside him, Arthur heard the faint, sharp clink of crystal against teeth. Claire had lowered her water glass. She wasn't looking at Gregory. She was looking at Arthur. For the first time since she had slid into the booth at the Italian restaurant, there was a crack in her impassive facade. It was tiny. A slight parting of her lips, a marginal widening of her dark eyes. "A grounded perspective," Claire said, smoothly, seamlessly stepping into the breach. "Exactly what Voss Industries needs as we navigate the upcoming quarter. Excuse us, Gregory. I see the Foundation, President." She turned her hand, sliding onto the small of Arthur's back. It was a possessive gesture meant for the room. But as they walked away, her fingers pressed flat against his spine, a silent, entirely unreadable weight. The black Maybach slid into the underground garage of the townhouse just past 1 in the morning. The ride back had been completely silent. The adrenaline that had kept Arthur upright through 3 hours of forced smiles, microscopic scrutiny, and terrible overpriced scallops had completely evaporated. It left behind a hollow, aching exhaustion that lived in the marrow of his bones. They rode the private elevator up to the main floor. The doors slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. The townhouse was dark, save for the low amber security lights illuminating the edges of the marble floor. The silence was absolute. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a vacuum. Claire stepped out, first slipping off her heels. She carried them in one hand, her emerald gown dragging slightly over the stone. She didn't look back at him. "Good night, Arthur," she said, her voice stripped of the throaty warmth she had used for the cameras. She was already walking toward her wing, a shadow retreating into the expensive darkness. "Good night," Arthur muttered to the empty air. He didn't go to his master suite. He walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward Lily's room. He pushed the heavy oak door open, wincing as the hinges let out a microscopic squeak. A small lamp shaped like a geometric owl cast a faint glow over the room. Lily was asleep in the massive wooden bed. She looked tiny, swallowed up by the sheer volume of the pristine white duvet. Sitting in a rigid chair by the window was a woman Arthur didn't recognize. She was reading a tablet, the blue light harsh against her sharp, severe features. Arthur stopped in the doorway. The woman looked up. "Mr. Pendleton," she whispered, crisply, standing up and smoothing her immaculate grey skirt. "I am Miss Abbott." "The night nurse." "Night nurse," Arthur echoed, keeping his voice low. He stepped into the room. The air smelled of lavender diffuser oil and starched linen. The familiar comforting scent of Lily's cheap strawberry shampoo was entirely gone. "She doesn't need a night nurse. She just has a lingering cold." Ms. Voss requested round-the-clock monitoring. Miss Abbott replied, her tone brooking no argument. She had a coughing fit at 9:30. I administered the organic syrup and checked her temperature. "It is normal. She has been asleep since." Arthur walked over to the bed. He reached out his calloused thumb, gently brushing a stray curl away from Lily's forehead. Her skin was cool. She was breathing evenly. He felt a sudden suffocating wave of uselessness. He was her father. He was supposed to be the one awake at 9:30 with the cough syrup. "Thank you," Arthur said, quietly pulling his hand back. "I'll take over from here." Miss Abbott frowned. "My shift is until 6 a.m., sir." "You can wait in the hall," Arthur said. He turned to look at her, the ghost of the anger he had felt at the gala surfacing in his eyes. "I'm sitting with my daughter. The nurse hesitated, assessing him before giving a stiff nod and silently leaving the room. Arthur sat in the rigid chair. He didn't take off his tailored jacket. He just sat there, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of Lily's breathing, feeling entirely like a trespasser in his own life. An hour later, the thirst drove him out of the room. His throat was parched, coated in the dust of fake conversations and anxiety. He walked down to the kitchen. It was an intimidating expanse of stainless steel and black granite. It looked like a laboratory, not a place where food was made. He opened the massive glass-fronted refrigerator. It was stocked with sparkling water, pressed green juices, and perfectly arranged rows of fruit. No milk. No cheap American cheese. "It's filtered from the tap," a voice said from the shadows. Arthur flinched, slamming the refrigerator door shut. Claire was sitting at the far end of the long granite island. She had stripped out of the emerald gown. She was wearing a heavy dark grey silk robe, her hair pulled back into a messy knot at the nape of her neck. An open laptop glowed in front of her, casting sharp, underlit shadows across her cheekbones. She had a tumbler of amber liquid in her hand. It didn't look like water. "You scared the hell out of me," Arthur breathed, walking over to the sink and grabbing a heavy glass from the drying rack. "You're jumpy," Claire noted. She didn't look up from her screen. She typed something rapidly, the keys clicking like tiny rapid-fire gunshots in the quiet room. "You handled Gregory well tonight." Arthur filled his glass. The water was shockingly cold. He drank it down in one long swallow. "I wasn't trying to handle him. I was trying not to hit him." Claire stopped typing. She reached out and took a slow sip of her drink. Ice clinked against the crystal. Aggression is a liability. But managed defiance, that plays well. It sells the narrative that you aren't intimidated by my money. It makes the romance look authentic. Arthur set his glass down. He looked at her. Really looked at her. Stripped of the armor of her suits and the glare of the cameras, she looked smaller, but no less dangerous. She looked incredibly deeply isolated. "Is that all this is to you?" Arthur asked, his voice rough. "Data points narratives." Claire finally looked up. Her dark eyes met his, completely devoid of the fabricated warmth from the red carpet. They were hollow. "This is survival, Arthur," she said softly, the harshness of the words at odds with the quietness of her tone. "If they push me out, they dismantle the company. Thousands of people lose their jobs. My father's legacy gets sold off for parts. So yes, it's all data points." She closed her laptop with a sharp snap. "Sleep well," Arthur Clare said, standing up and taking her glass with her. "The photographer arrives at 10 tomorrow morning. They want pictures of us making pancakes with your daughter. Try to look like you enjoy it." The kitchen was no longer a kitchen. It had been transformed into a soundstage by a crew of 6 people who spoke entirely in breathless whispers. 2 massive umbrella-like lights flanked the granite island, radiating a dry, artificial heat that made the back of Arthur's neck prickle with sweat. A woman in a black turtleneck was meticulously dusting organic buckwheat flour across the pristine black countertop. She used a tiny fine mesh sieve, treating the flour like it was gold dust. "Just a touch of mess," she murmured to herself, stepping back to admire the completely calculated dusting. "We want lived in, authentic." Arthur stood off to the side, wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than his first car. It was soft, yes, but it trapped the heat of the lighting rigs, making his skin crawl. Lily was perched on a tall, modern stool, her legs dangling. She was wearing a matching, smaller version of the sweater. She kept scratching her collarbone. "Daddy, it tickles," she complained, her voice nasal. The lingering cold was mostly gone, but she was entirely overwhelmed by the strangers. "I know, Bug," Arthur said, softly, moving to stand beside her. He slipped a finger under the collar of the sweater, pulling it away from her skin. "Just a little longer. Then we can go take it off." Claire entered the kitchen a moment later. She wore a perfectly tailored pair of raw denim jeans and a white silk button-down, the sleeves rolled up precisely to the elbow. Her hair was down, styled into loose, effortless waves that had taken a stylist 45 minutes to achieve. She looked like a catalogue model playing a mother. She smelled of hairspray and expensive anxiety. "All right positions, everyone," the photographer, a thin man named Olivier, called out. He clapped his hands once. Claire behind the island. Arthur stand close to her hip to hip, hand over hers on the spatula. "Lily, darling, look at the bowl. Try to look hungry." Claire stepped into the glare of the lights. She picked up the wooden spatula. Her grip was tight, her knuckles turning white. She looked like she was preparing to fend off an intruder, not flip a pancake. Arthur moved in beside her. The physical proximity was jarring. In the 2 weeks they had lived in the townhouse, they hadn't been within 3 feet of each other without an audience. Now Olivier was demanding he press his hip against hers. He leaned in. Claire was rigid. Her body felt like a marble statue under the silk shirt. He reached out and covered her hand with his. Her skin was freezing. "Relax," Arthur muttered, keeping his voice so low the microphone boom hovering above them wouldn't catch it. "You're holding it like a murder weapon." "I don't cook," Claire hissed back through a closed-mouth smile. "My chef prepares my meals. I don't even know what is in this bowl. It's batter," Arthur said dryly. "It won't bite. Just loosen your fingers." "Beautiful," Olivier shouted, the shutter on his camera clicking furiously. "Now Claire, scoop some batter. Let's get some action." Lily reached for the spoon. Claire stiffly dug a ladle into the thick, greyish buckwheat batter. She brought it up her arm, jerky. Lily, eager for something to do, reached out with both hands. Her small fingers grabbed the handle of the ladle just as Claire tried to pull it back. The ladle tipped. A massive wet glob of batter missed the hot griddle entirely and hit the granite counter. It splashed, sending thick droplets onto Claire's pristine white silk shirt and across Arthur's knuckles. The heavy ceramic bowl, unbalanced by the sudden movement, tipped over the edge of the island. It hit the floor with a catastrophic, echoing crash. Ceramic shards and grey sludge exploded across the teak floorboards. The crew gasped in unison. The woman in the black turtleneck looked like she might cry. Olivier lowered his camera, his face pale. Claire froze. She stared down at the mess, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. She didn't move. She didn't speak. For a second, the titanium armor slipped completely, and Arthur saw absolute, sheer panic in her eyes. She didn't know the script for this. She didn't know how to handle a broken bowl and a messy child. Lily's lower lip began to tremble. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Arthur didn't hesitate. He dropped the spatula, stepped away from Claire, and knelt down in the mess. He ignored the wet batter soaking into the knees of his designer jeans. Hey, look at me," Arthur said, his voice dropping into the steady rumbling register he used when the monsters under Lily's bed were too loud. He grabbed a cloth napkin off the counter and gently wiped a speck of batter off Lily's cheek. "It's just a bowl bug. Gravity happens. Nobody is mad." He looked up, aiming a glare at the frozen crew. Someone get a broom. And a wet towel. No one moved. They were all looking at Claire, waiting for an explosion, firing a CEO-level meltdown. Claire finally blinked. She looked down at Arthur, kneeling in the ruin of the photo shoot, his large hands carefully checking Lily for cuts. The panic slowly drained from her face, replaced by a profound, silent confusion. She was watching a language she didn't speak. She reached for a roll of paper towels. She tore off a haphazard, jagged strip, knelt down directly into the wet batter beside Arthur, and started wiping the floor. "Claire, your jeans," the stylist choked out. "Shut up," Claire said. The voice wasn't harsh, it was just tired. She looked at Arthur. A smudge of grey batter was smeared across her cheekbone. Arthur reached out. He didn't think about it. His calloused thumb brushed against her cheek, wiping the wet flour away from her skin. For a fraction of a second, Claire leaned into the pressure of his hand. It was an infinitesimal movement, a tiny surrender to being touched by someone who wasn't demanding anything from her. Click. Olivier had raised his camera. He captured the messy floor, the ruined clothes, and the heavy, unscripted silence passing between them. "That's the shot," Olivier whispered. A month into the arrangement, the silence of the townhouse became its own kind of weight. It pressed against Arthur's eardrums when he lay awake at night. The PR campaign was working. The photograph of them on the kitchen floor had run in a major business weekly under the headline, "The Humanizing of Voss Industries." Gregory Thorne and the board had backed off. The stock price had stabilized. They had successfully manufactured a reality. And yet the reality inside the walls was utterly barren. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The rain outside was relentless, driving hard against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room. Arthur was awake. The mattress in his master suite was too soft. It didn't support his lower back the way his terrible futon had. He walked down the carpeted hallway toward the kitchen, wearing worn-out grey sweatpants and a faded t-shirt he had specifically hidden from the styling team. He wanted water. He wanted something that didn't feel curated. As he passed the heavy soundproofed doors that led to Claire's wing, he stopped. There was a sound. It was incredibly faint, muffled by the expensive architecture, but Arthur's ears were tuned to the microscopic noises of a sleeping child. He knew what a disruption sounded like. It was a sharp, percussive crack. Glass breaking. The contract was clear. Separate wings. Privacy was absolute. But Arthur looked at the dark wood of the door, thought of the absolute isolation Claire operated in, and pushed the handle down. The door yielded silently. He walked down her corridor. The air here was colder smelling of ozone and expensive paper. Light spilled from a partially open doorway at the far end, her study. Arthur pushed the door open. The room was a disaster. Stacks of financial reports, usually aligned with surgical precision, were scattered across the heavy mahogany desk. A heavy crystal tumbler lay shattered against the baseboard amber liquid, seeping into the cream-colored Persian rug. Claire was sitting on the floor behind her desk. Her knees were pulled up to her chest. She was wearing the dark silk robe, but it was slipping off one shoulder. Her face was buried in her arms. She wasn't crying. There was no sound at all. She was just incredibly rigidly still, coiled so tight she looked like she might snap in half. Arthur stepped into the room. His bare foot crunched softly on a stray shard of crystal. Claire's head snapped up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, wide, and entirely feral. "Get out!" Her voice was a rasp, completely stripped of its usual authority. Arthur didn't leave. He looked at the shattered glass. He looked at the iPad glowing on her desk, displaying an email with the subject line, "Emergency Shareholder Vote. Restructuring." Gregory Thorne wasn't backing off. He was digging in. "You're bleeding," Arthur said calmly. Claire looked down. A jagged piece of crystal had grazed her ankle when the glass shattered. A thin, dark line of blood was welling up, staining the pale skin. She stared at it like it belonged to someone else. "Leave Arthur," she repeated. She pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. "You are in breach of contract." "Fire me in the morning," Arthur muttered. He walked into her adjoining private bathroom. It was a cavern of white marble and mirrored surfaces. He opened 3 drawers before he found a first aid kit tucked behind a row of unopened expensive night creams. He grabbed a saline wipe, and a bandage turned off the harsh overhead vanity light, and walked back into the study. Claire hadn't moved. She watched him approach with a mixture of hostility and profound exhaustion. Arthur crouched down in front of her. He didn't ask for permission. He reached out and gently gripped her calf. Her muscles were knotted tight as steel cables under his hand. He tore open the saline wipe. "This is going to sting," he said. He pressed the wipe to the cut. Claire flinched a sharp intake of breath, hissing through her teeth, but she didn't pull her leg away. Arthur cleaned the blood, his movements slow and deliberate. The smell of antiseptic cut through the scent of spilled scotch. "They have the votes," Claire whispered suddenly. Her voice cracked. She didn't look at him. She looked at the dark window, watching the rain blur the city lights. Gregory bought out 2 of the minority shareholders privately. He's going to call a vote of no confidence. It doesn't matter how many pancakes we make. Arthur peeled the backing off the bandage. He smoothed it over the small cut. He kept his hand on her ankle for a second longer than necessary, letting the steady warmth of his palm sink into her freezing skin. "When I was 24, Arthur said, quietly, looking down at his hand, I opened a small contracting business, took out loans, bought a truck. 3 months in, my partner embezzled the accounts and vanished. The bank took the truck. They took my apartment. I had to move into a basement with my pregnant wife." Claire looked down at him. The hostility in her eyes had fractured, leaving behind a raw, naked curiosity. "What did you do?" she asked. "I swept floors at the hardware store until they let me work the register," Arthur said. He finally looked up, meeting her gaze. "You don't panic when the house catches fire, Claire. You don't throw glass. You grab whatever you can carry, you walk out, and you figure out how to lay a new foundation tomorrow." He let go of her leg and stood up. He walked over to the baseboard, picked up the largest shards of the broken tumbler, and tossed them into the metal wastebasket. "Go to sleep," Arthur said, turning toward the door. "You can't fight a board of directors if you're bleeding on the rug." He walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. He didn't know if he had helped. He didn't know if she would fire him tomorrow. But as he walked back to his side of the house, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. The smell of cheap, dark roast coffee filled the sterile kitchen at 6 in the morning. Arthur had walked 3 blocks in the freezing drizzle to a corner bodega to buy a French press and a bag of generic grounds. The townhouse's $10,000 espresso machine sat unused. Arthur pushed down the metal plunger, watching the dark liquid bloom. He needed something that tasted like actual dirt and effort today. He poured 2 mugs, just as the heavy oak doors of the east wing clicked open. Claire walked into the kitchen. She wasn't wearing her usual aggressive charcoal or stark white. She was wearing a navy blue suit. The fabric was softer, less structured, moving with her instead of acting as a shield. Arthur stared at the color. Navy. The fake favorite color from their fabricated history. "You're up early," Arthur said. His voice was a low rasp in the quiet room. "I couldn't sleep," Claire replied. She stopped at the edge of the granite island, looking at the 2 steaming mugs. She didn't ask what it was. She just picked one up, brought it to her lips, and took a sip. She winced slightly at the bitter, unrefined taste, but she didn't put it down. "It's vote day." "I know." Arthur leaned against the counter. He crossed his arms, feeling the worn cotton of his t-shirt pulling across his shoulders. "Do you want me there?" Claire looked at him over the rim of the mug. The exhaustion in her dark eyes was profound, but the feral panic from the other night was gone. It had been replaced by something cold and incredibly dense. "You're my husband, Arthur. You are the foundation of my public stability. Yes, I want you in the room." 3 hours later, the air inside the 42nd floor boardroom smelled of lemon wax, stale air conditioning, and the sour metallic tang of nervous sweat disguised by expensive cologne. The mahogany table stretched for 20 feet. 14 board members sat around it. Gregory sat directly opposite Claire, his thick fingers resting on a stack of printed packets. He looked bloated with anticipated victory. Arthur sat in a leather chair pushed against the back wall, designated as an observer. He kept his hands flat on his knees. He felt the familiar, suffocating itch of being in a room where his net worth was less than the cost of the catered pastries sitting on the side console. "The motion is clear," Gregory stated, his voice booming over the low hum of the HVAC. "Voss Industries is hemorrhaging public trust. The stock is volatile. We need a restructuring of leadership. We need someone at the helm who isn't alienated from the common market." He shot a patronizing glance at Arthur. Claire didn't react. She sat perfectly straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She let Gregory talk. She let him lay out his entire blueprint, exposing every beam and joist of his argument. When Gregory finally stopped leaning back with a smug, expectant exhale, the room fell dead silent. Claire picked up a single manila folder from the table. She didn't open it. "You're right," Gregory Claire said smoothly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a razor wire. "A house with a rotten foundation will eventually collapse, which is why I spent the last 48 hours examining yours." Gregory's smug expression faltered. "Excuse me. I know about the private sell-offs." Claire continued, her tone entirely conversational, which somehow made it terrifying. "I know you promised 3 of our regional supply hubs to a competitor in exchange for their backing on this vote. You aren't trying to restructure the company to save it. You're trying to sell it for parts." The boardroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. 2 of the older board members shifted uncomfortably, refusing to look at Gregory. "That is a baseless accusation." Gregory sputtered, his face flushing a dangerous mottled purple. He slammed a hand on the table. "You are desperate, Claire." "I am pragmatic," Claire corrected. She opened the folder and slid a stack of stapled papers down the polished mahogany. It stopped perfectly in front of the oldest board member. "Those are the encrypted emails legally subpoenaed this morning by our legal team. Furthermore, I spent yesterday meeting with the ground-level logistics unions. If Gregory's restructuring passes, they strike at midnight. All of them. The entire supply chain halts. The stock won't just be volatile, it will flatline." Arthur watched her. His chest felt tight, like he had swallowed a stone. She wasn't fighting them in the abstract. She was using the floorboards, the nails, the raw, ugly reality of the business. She hadn't panicked. She had grabbed what she could carry, and she was burning Gregory's house down. The vote never happened. Gregory resigned before noon, citing immediate health reasons. At 1 o'clock, Arthur was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window in Claire's private office, watching the city traffic crawl like metal ants far below. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. Claire walked in. She bypassed her massive desk entirely and walked straight over to the small leather sofa in the corner. She kicked off her heels. They hit the carpet with a dull thud. She collapsed onto the cushions, letting her head fall back against the leather. "It's done," she whispered. Arthur turned around. He looked at her, the brutal, brilliant CEO who had just gutted a man in a boardroom, now looking completely devastatingly human. "You laid a hell of a foundation today." Claire opened her eyes. She reached into the pocket of her navy suit jacket. She pulled out a heavy, textured piece of paper. It was the contract, the 3-year agreement that dictated their fake lives. Arthur felt a sudden drop in his stomach. The crisis was over. She was secure. She didn't need the prop anymore. The survival math kicked back into his brain. He had the trust fund. Lily was safe. He should be relieved. He just felt incredibly heavily empty. So Arthur muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets to hide the slight tremor in his fingers. "I'll pack the boxes. Mrs. Gable can call the SUV." Claire stared at him. She looked at the contract in her hands. Then slowly, deliberately, she gripped the thick paper and ripped it in half. The tearing sound was loud in the quiet office. She stacked the halves and tore them again. Arthur stopped breathing. "What are you doing?" She tossed the shredded pieces onto the glass coffee table. "The board is secure." "I don't need a prop," Arthur Clare said, her voice dropping, losing all its corporate polish. She looked up at him, her dark eyes entirely stripped of their armor. "I don't want a contract. I don't want separate wings. I want to see what happens when the cameras are off." Arthur stood perfectly still. He smelled the faint scent of rain against the glass, the ozone of the office, and the reality of the woman sitting in front of him. He slowly pulled his hands out of his pockets. He walked over to the sofa, sitting down beside her. He didn't say a word. He just reached out his rough, calloused fingers, finding hers, and held on. When the cameras stop flashing and the ink on the contract is torn away, what remains is the raw, unscripted truth. Arthur and Claire started as a transaction, a desperate father and a calculating CEO, playing a high-stakes game of survival. But in the quiet moments between the lies, they found something real to build on. Did you expect Claire to tear up the contract? Drop a comment below with your thoughts on their unscripted future. If you felt every tense, grounded moment of this story, hit that like button, share it, and subscribe for more deeply human drama.